Welcome to the House of Jesus. House of Jesus communities are those that are constantly aligning themselves to Jesus, the cornerstone. Accordingly, they preach and teach the words of Jesus, and they walk out his ways. The vision of this video series is to unpack Jesus' culture of godly love and equipping-based empowerment. As we do so, we will detail the biblical foundation for our convictions, as well as provide practical strategies for implementing the Master's ways. But be assured, walking out Jesus' ways is not a decision, but a lifelong calling and process. We are humbled that you are joining us on this quest. The 8th video is entitled Equipping a Team and has been recorded in partnership with Drew Stedman, a church planting catalyst. This teaching summarizes how Jesus utilized his culture of godly relationships and equipping-based empowerment to catalyze a 5-fold small group. In doing so, we highlight how Jesus' strategy is ideal for every kind of kingdom-focused group. As we summarize Jesus' ways, listeners will be reminded relational trust is the essential prerequisite for Jesus' teams. The 5 equipping values unpack Jesus' process for embedding apprenticing and empowerment within a team. And, like Jesus' example, our objective as team leaders is always to raise up the next generation of leaders. My prayer is that this resource accelerates your alignment to Jesus' ways.
Charlie, can you take us back to Jesus' life group philosophy? And how do you see this being expressed with him?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of themes that I just keep seeing over and over again. And what you just said is right on par with what I'm thinking and what I've been seeing. Obviously, Jesus has a couple of preeminent commandments for us. The second one is to love one another. And so to me, that's what making godly relationships is all about. And that's why it's so foundational. And that's where it starts. And really, trust grows out of that. It is grounded in humility, compassion, patience, authenticity. And Drew, I think that it's not only a precondition for the life group getting off to a good start, but obviously it can sustain the group, that it's not a one-off situation where you're trying to help people understand what relational trust is. It's kind of an ongoing, over and over again priority. And so you have to keep hitting the nail. And in my book, I tell the story of a pastor in his very first sermon. He pulls out this piece of wood and he starts driving these nails in it. And he had 3 things that he wanted to hit over and over again. And one of them was about relational trust. And it's so important to keep that in front of people. But there's more to it than just that. And this next slide really emphasizes the second element that I see in regards to Jesus. From my perspective, his team philosophy is obviously making godly relationships, but it's sharing leadership, authority, and responsibility. And I see this so clearly in Peter, James, and John. 24 to 30 months approximately from the time he's knocking on their door and pulling them into more of his understanding and taking them around and teaching those 3 individuals. He's going to be leaving. He knows that. He knows that his upper room is his exit strategy. And so even though he is the singular leader at the outset of his ministry with those 12, pretty quickly, he is beginning to pull them into the things that he is in charge of and responsible for. And he wants to open the door to them stepping in to those roles. And I don't think that that's the only way. This is my picture of a life group paradigm based on Jesus and those 3. And I don't want you to see this as limited to those 3. There's so many different ways you can develop a leadership team. in a life group and or a ministry team. And yet there are some common pieces and elements to this. And frankly, Drew, one of the things that has been a part of my experience in leading a life group is I never wanted to stay leading the life group. I've started so many, but my end game always was to let them lead and to leave and start another group or whatever. How would you describe your leadership paradigm for life groups?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you, Charlie, because I think this is the central issue. The best advice I received this when I first started leading a life group from a guy that was mentoring me and discipling me. He told me, Drew, your job is to work yourself out of a job. And so when I see my leadership, I was not thinking, how do I become the best person at leading a discussion or whatever element of a group, even though those are skills that you want to grow into and develop. But what I was thinking is, how am I raising up others around me so they can walk in the fullness of their gifting? And for me, I would see that holistically. If I'm not just looking for other people who have a leadership gift, but I would love every member of the group as part of their time in the group to grow as a disciple of Jesus in the context of community and start to walk out in their giftings. And I was always looking for that. Like, where is gifting? Where is somebody? So sometimes it's a complementary gifting. They're awesome at hospitality. Maybe I'm stressed out about creating a hospitable environment, and so I want to see and identify that person and call them up. Or maybe I see the raw material of a leadership gift. A lot of times it was somebody who was a great life group leader, but very different from me, but that gift was still on them. So I wanted to see it as my job was to develop other people around me so that ultimately I could work myself out of a job. And I think this is the heart of this whole training that we're doing, is this whole concept. And I've said it before, but I think it's worth repeating. If as a leader, you wait until you need people, it's too late.
Yeah.
Instead, you need to develop people simply because it's the right thing to do when they're ready. And then we are multiplying leaders. And if we want to be church planters, if we want to multiply the kingdom, this idea is critical to everything that we do. Otherwise, what I've seen happen over and over again with life group and with church is we have people who get very comfortable in their role. It's not that they are against developing others, but it's also not a priority for them. They're not thinking about it. Then all of a sudden, the church is either growing and they realize they don't have enough people to steward the growth, or God is initiating a transition. And that starts to throw off our whole model. So in a life group, I mean, how many life group stories start with somebody who leads the group? The group has a good run for a year, 2 years. Then that person gets burned out, or God calls them on to something else. They haven't developed other people and there's nobody ready to take over the group. And so either what you do at that point is you throw somebody in who's not ready, or the group itself kind of dissolves and falls apart because there's no one to take over leadership. And that, unfortunately, I think is probably more the norm than the exception. And I would love, even on a life group level, I would love to reverse that trend where we are multiplying leaders everywhere we go. We're intentional about it. And then, it doesn't mean that groups won't dissolve. Of course they will. But I would love for the testimony of every life group that it multiplied laborers into God's harvest field from a diversity of different giftings and styles, people that are equipped and raised up to do the things of the kingdom. So that's my heart cry and prayer. And for sure, how I challenge everybody, if you are a church planter or involved in church leadership, to understand your role that way, first and foremost, because I think that's the only way that we can really be a great commission people in the end.
So let's unpack this a little bit more. It's pretty easy to say shared leadership, authority, and responsibility. Actually, how do you do that? The very first piece to me is building unity around kingdom essentials, meaning if I'm going to invite you or a group of individuals to co-lead with me, we need to be on the same page. If we're not on the same page, it's not going to work. And we've been in that life group, and we've probably been on that ministry team where there wasn't unity around essentials. And sometimes we just launch in, hey, we love each other. We don't need to talk about all this stuff. We'll just kind of figure it out as we go. Well, sometimes you can figure it out as you go, but sometimes the lack of clarity at the outset, you just get into difficult situations and different philosophies, and it becomes extremely difficult. One of the things that's challenging, Drew, is to kind of figure out how you find that clarity or develop that clarity by pulling people into a dialogue. I describe it as fostering DNA buy-in through participation. And last time you talked about, that was actually a love language of yours. You highlighted that it's really important for you and you really appreciate when people bring you into that process. Tell me about why that is so important to you and how you are seeing others wanting to participate as clarity is defined in a life group or ministry team context.
Yeah, Charlie, something I realized about myself was there are times I can think of where somebody made a decision that I agreed with, but I was on a leadership team with them and they didn't pull me into it. And it actually rubbed me the wrong way, even though I agreed with the final decision. And because I felt like, if I'm called to be part of this team, and if that's something I've been asked to do, then I want to be able to have a place to seek God together with you. There's been other times where I was part of the team that made a decision that I disagreed with, but I was able to get behind what was decided with full conviction because it got to be a dialogue process together. And that struck me, that was like something that hit me. And then I started seeing that same trend of, very difficult decisions at times churches have to navigate. But if they'll slow down a little bit and invite people in to dialogue, it's amazing to me how much peace there is on hard decisions where there's a lot of room for disagreement, but it's the community together seeking the Lord. But then there's other times where almost always for the sake of expediency, we try to skip that process because we just assume. And, it's not that people are pushing back on you because even they disagree with the decision. There's been a couple times where I've explicitly said, I agree with this decision. However, this is what was hard for me. And it was the lack of ability to contribute. Now, to balance that, you can't pull everybody into every decision. And I'm not advocating that. And, there's some people that are called to be part of leadership teams. There's other people that would like to be, but that's just not what God's called them to. And we all have to be okay with the role God's given us. And I've been on all sides of that equation. I've been a point leader where I realized that on this decision, I needed to just make a decision ultimately. I've been on a team that was more collaborative, and I've been in an environment where I was under somebody else's leadership. Sometimes I was invited to speak in, and sometimes there's decisions where that wasn't my place at that time. So that's the balance to this statement. I'm more referring to a principle, but I found even in cases where I don't have to ask somebody, if I'll go out of my way to foster conversation where we're dialoguing together, what is the word of the Lord? Who are we called to be? And a lot of times what I'll try to do is even reflect other people's language. So it might be something that I care about, but somebody else expresses it in a way that's really meaningful to them. I'll just adopt their language, because it's my same value. Anytime I can do that, and if I have that in my mind, the buy-in we get is so much higher than if I make the assumption that, oh yeah, they're with me, let's do this. And in the long run, I've been surprised later on down the road when there becomes trial, those people who went through that process, they become your greatest allies because this wasn't just your decision. This was our decision. And then, then it's an issue of all of us together are reinforcing and standing on this, which I think is really helpful for the life of a church.
That's good, Drew. And I think Acts 15 is a tremendous example of nailing clarity among, it looks like a diverse group of individuals. We don't get a lot of specifics about how long it took, whether their voices were raised against one another, as they were arguing their points. But clearly, it makes a big difference. It seemed good to the Holy Spirit in us, and they were able to go out with unity in all directions and speak together in a way that was unifying. And obviously, we know that there had been some challenging moments even before they got to Acts 15 with arguments in regards to this issue. So I think that this type of collegial consensus based conversation is really important to really nail that clarity so that leaders can be unified. Well, the next piece related to Jesus' team philosophy, from my perspective, is really what we see in this Peter, James, and John triad, is catalyzing diversity of spiritual gifts. I see those three individuals as really different types of folks with different experiences and different spiritual giftings. I think that I see myself as a competent life group leader, at least to begin, but there is no way that I can fulfill all the roles in a life group. And so I have a very great need to pull other people in with me. We did this exercise in Boston a couple of years ago where we identified 17 different potential gift mixes that could be leveraged to help the life group function at a very high level. And so, Drew, I kind of assume you're the same way, that even though you actually have, at least you could hold it together in terms of a life group, that, you know yourself well enough that there are roles that not only can you not do with exceptionally, but you probably don't want to do them. You don't want to be in charge of all of them. So kind of tell me what happens as you think about, as you look around a new life group. What are you trying to pull off? How do you kind of see what your strength is and then find other people to round you out?
I always like to separate some of this on a life group level, but this probably applies to the church. There are certain tasks that need to be done that I don't know are necessarily somebody's spiritual gift. It's like, I don't know that many people, I'll use this as a church example, even though we're talking about life group, have the gift of stacking chairs. I call it like taking out the trash. Like there's some jobs that just have to happen, clean up after life group, or, whatever the case may be. And sometimes you're in a group where there's nobody gifted for a critical task. And so somebody needs to serve the group by just doing it. But there's other times where there's somebody who does have a gift. So a few that I always look for, one is hospitality. Is there someone where their gift is they love creating a hospitable environment? And you got to be careful, because that doesn't mean they always provide the snacks, but are they thinking through, how are we welcoming people, creating a warm environment where people really feel welcomed in? And I love it. If I can find somebody like that, then I'll let them come up with a snack plan and theme nights and parties and just anything like that, even guest follow-up. How do we welcome new people? How do we ensure that we're getting to know one another? And so if you can have a hospitality coordinator, that's a blast. Discipleship of children. And there's all kinds of protocols you probably need to have for child safety. I've been a part of some groups where it's a bunch of tired parents. And so it's more of we're going to sign up and we're each going to take, in groups of two, always, we're going to each take a week and take care of the kids, or occasionally hire babysitters. But then you might have a group where there's a person who has a passion for how we disciple children, maybe even integrating them with the adults in the life group, whatever the case may be. So I'm looking for that passion. And a lot of times you find passion through people's frustrations. So this is in a life group, when somebody's coming to me and they're consistently telling me we're not organized enough, that's actually probably a sign that they're administrative, and maybe I'm not. So to the level that needs to be. So rather than getting defensive and frustrated, normally what I'll do is invite them to be part of the solution and really view that as a gift to the group. Now, people can express that negatively. Worship is another obvious one, pastoral care. Those are maybe gifts that are a little easier. So I'm just always scanning where I see those gifts. And then if there's somebody who comes to me and they consistently have vision for what life group could be, that's a leadership gift. And normally with somebody like that, I don't think I would lead the life group without a partner, because I'm always looking for at least one other partner.
Yeah.
But I want to have my eyes open anytime I see somebody where I just have a hint, even if they haven't expressed it yet. I'll still sit down, have the conversation, asking, hey, is that something that's in your heart? So I'm scanning, I'm looking. I've invented so many life group roles over the years. I love that you guys came up with 17. Sometimes I saw a gift on someone's life that didn't really fit the life group, but I still made a roll up for them because I wanted to honor the gifting and invite them into participation as we lead the group together.
That's good. And one of the things that I think is important to highlight as you are gathering a group of individuals who have different types of giftings is that there is an inherent tension between the various spiritual gifts. Even just as I think of apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, and teacher, those five see life really differently. And it's very important for there to be, again, this is why the relational values are important, but it's also important to be able to define roles and to help people see how those hold together. One of the things that those of you who are watching, you might not have noticed this, but in this next slide, you can see that in the upper right-hand corner of my template, there is a design and build term, and that's very purposeful. Some of you may know that there are organizations that combine architects and general contractors under the same roof, and that's not always been done. But in recent years, it's been learned that if you can get the architects and the general contractors to partner together in designing and building buildings, that it works much better. But there is an inherent tension between those who design, which are more, in my mind, the apostles and prophets, versus those who implement ministry, which to me is led primarily by evangelists, pastors, and teachers. And so this tension is really important to be aware of. And Drew, I know, unfortunately, you have jumped into the middle of some of the tension that exists in diverse teams. What are some of the things that you have learned from that experience?
Such a great point, Charlie. Something I learned from Jimmy Seibert, our lead pastor here in Waco, was there are tensions to solve and tensions to manage. This one is a healthy tension that I am grateful for, even though it's not always easy. And it's actually great. If you are somebody who's more of an implementer, it's really healthy that you have somebody that pushes you outside your comfort zone. And you need that, to walk in the fullness of your gift. Likewise, if you're a dreamer, you need somebody that's asking you to count the cost and see the impact of your dreams on others and make sure that your dream actually happens. And so, where this gets the most off typically is where we lose sight of the fact that God made us a body that has many parts, and the eye is just different than the nose, and they both need each other under the headship of Christ. Or if we are misaligned on our relational values, if there's not humility, honor, and ability to even recognize, like I'll just say there's times where I'm maybe more the dreamer and I'm a point leader. And so I'm confident in that role, but then I have to also recognize that there are certain decisions where I need to defer to somebody that we've raised up as the implementer. And I actually need to, even if I don't love the decision, I have to get behind them because that's their role on this team. And they need my full support, and we need to have dialogue together. And likewise, they have to do the same for me with my role on the team. And so these are healthy tensions in the life of a church. This tension should be there. I would actually be worried if there was a church that had no tension. That would make me think, okay, it's probably a lot of people that all think the same, and they're probably going to make some big mistakes at some point. You need to have some of this, but honor becomes so important and humility becomes so important so that this tension does not become a negative thing, but actually is a blessing in the life of the church. I'd say most marriages have this, and not all. I know a few couples, but it's actually great. If you have one spouse that's always wanting to have fun and do something spontaneous and go on adventures, like you need that. But then you need to have another spouse who's keeping up with the money and being realistic about commitments. And that actually, just like in a marriage, in a healthy marriage, you learn to embrace and celebrate that diversity and even praise God and seek it out. For the health of the marriage and ultimately so you can walk in your calling. So Charlie, this next discipline is really important, but it's also complex. And a lot of times, like let's go back to life groups. If your life group is evangelistic and growing, you are introducing new people, but then you have a lot of people who've been around for longer, and learning how to pull those newer people into the life and the community of the group while also continuing to lead and involve the people who've been around for some time. That's a tough dynamic. And you see the same thing with the church. You might have a launch team of people that have walked really closely and dreamed into the life of the church. Well, then you go plant a church and you start reaching new people that are joining that don't have all that back history. They didn't all come from the same sending church. They weren't part of your fasting and prayer when you were lining out all your values. And so how do we do this part well, where we are consistently open to God sending us new people and involving them in the life of the group? Well, we also continue to honor and celebrate the veterans, those who've been around a little bit longer, and the role that they carry.
Yeah, when I was first learning to work in a life group context, I was trying to do the orientation for new folks within the life group, and that didn't work very well. People were frustrated that, it just seemed like constantly we were stopping for a significant amount of time in our life group to help bring people up to speed. So Mary Lou and I finally figured out that we needed to mobilize ourselves and others to invite some of these new folks over for supper or a meal or whatever, and allow them to kind of ask questions and for us to share what the heart of our life group was about. And I realized, it's really the same way in a staff context, that as individuals come into the staff and or a new team, there's just a need to kind of separate and figure out, okay, what do they need to catch up? What's the individual way in which we can apprentice one or more individuals who are being onboarded into the environment? I know you have been a part of that in your context, and I have found it super valuable to do that. In fact, in a prior church, I would spend 9 months doing that. I mean, that sounds like a lot, but there was they couldn't learn it all at the same time. They needed some periodic opportunities to ask new questions. This month, this is what I'm struggling with. So you just want to be very aware of that as you are sharing leadership authority and responsibility, is that there's an onboarding process that has to happen for folks to understand the clarity, the diversity, and the way in which the team is organized and what it's about. So I do think that's important. It's easy to forget, but it's a helpful priority. Obviously, we want to be able to sustain a culture of development for everyone. We want to think about that. And so equipping a team is super important. You're obviously having group sessions together. Life group is needing to do the same thing, but it's obviously complex. Drew, we have highlighted the etymology of the equipping term in Ephesians 4:11, and it's a multifaceted word, meaning training an athlete or realigning a broken bone, restoring a home to mint condition. Help me understand some of the things that you've been doing lately with various kinds of teams to try to coach them, try to pull them back together, keep them focused. What are some of your go-to questions and the processes you use to help maintain unity, purpose, direction as you invest in them?
A good friend of mine challenged me one time, gave me this great leadership advice that when I lead a team meeting, especially my personality, I typically have something to say. He challenged me. He said, Drew, rather than spending your time thinking about what you're going to say, spend your time thinking about the questions you're going to ask. And specifically, I found it helpful to think of questions that begin with the word what. It forces me, rather than just, was the event good or bad? That's not always great. Or how did the event go? Again, it's a good, okay question. But if you can start saying, what about this event do we feel like was most helpful based on what God has called us to do? Or what was the most positive element of this in people's experience? And ideally, even getting some survey data from people wherever possible. What are things we could learn for next time? What are things we might want to do differently? Any kind of question like that. So I tend to think a lot of it, as we've talked about previously, I believe it was last time on the life-giving coaching, where we talked about scheduling and debriefs, and I think you can do that at any level, where it's anytime we do something, anytime we've had, whether it's a broad ministry goal and a couple times a year, we're going to pull away and evaluate how it's going, or we've just hosted a big event, we've just started something new. If you can think of some good questions, and my little trick is with the word what that allows you to do then is to ask the team. Sometimes I'll get up on a whiteboard and I'll look for themes and say, okay, it seems like the consensus is this was really helpful, but these are a couple areas where next time we'd want to grow together. And that's happening on a team level. And then we've talked previously how to do that on an interpersonal level with the members of your team, where you're both giving and inviting feedback as well. And just like I said last time, the trick for this that I'd encourage all of you is do it consistently. Don't wait until there's an element of ongoing development where your team's growth has been stunted because you're not addressing it, and then you have to turn it into a huge mountain. Instead, make it a normal operating part of your team, is that you give each other feedback, you create that environment, and ultimately it's in service to what God has called you to. And so you guys are so committed to the call of God that then you're working together to ensure that you're walking in the fullness of what He has spoken. Now, this brings us to the last point, and it's this, that you need to expect ongoing challenges. Obviously, at this point, you see that we are just walking you through the team philosophy. We're just restating what's on that slide that we started with. And at this point, hopefully, this is all pretty familiar to everyone that's listening. We have not gotten to this last part on transition yet, so we'll do that next month. But I do want to highlight a few things that I think are worth getting into today. First, there is a real enemy, and the enemy is prowling around, and we need to not minimize the reality of spiritual warfare and the fact that there are forces of darkness that are coming against us. And I found for this, I have to be really careful. The force of darkness is not the people on my team. The force of darkness is the influence on all the members of my team. And that's why spiritual warfare and prayer, and even prayer together as a team, it's amazing to me. I would encourage anyone leading any team, including a life group, when are you praying together? And that helps so much of just, I think, combating this part of it. But the second thing is you can have a team that's very united together in the spirit, but one size doesn't fit all. And this is something that as I've grown and matured in ministry, I've had to realize that, there are certain teams that the team is just not a fit for somebody. There's life groups where I've coached somebody, this life group may not be a fit. There's churches where the church is not a fit. And we need to not see that as a division always. It can be divisive if it's not handled well. But I found it's sometimes a mature conversation to have with somebody that's based on, maybe the influence they want, based on the way that they want to express their particular gifting, based on the vision they have, that this group or this church just isn't going to be the right place for them and is probably going to introduce some tension. A lot of times as I have to go back and kind of do a postmortem on whether it was a staff problem at a church, a leadership problem, or even a life group division, almost always there were a ton of red flags that got ignored. And they were conversations about something not being a fit where people wanted it to happen. And so they just blew past it and hoped it would get better later. And that's something you said at the beginning of this episode, Charlie. It's the kingdom essentials, but it is not just the kingdom essentials. Sometimes it's a preference thing as well. And it's better once you identify that there is a potential problem there, it's just better to go ahead and let's talk about it. And in my experience, most of these are not big kingdom value issues. A lot of them just come down to preference. There's a lot of people that I love and respect, but I don't know that I would want to be in their life group. And it's not because I don't love them. It's just, I don't know that that would be a good fit for who God's made me and how I could best contribute under their leadership. And that's fine. I'm not making a judgment of them or myself. I'm just acknowledging what is so that I can better be friends and not potentially put myself in an environment that's going to create tension for them or for me. So that I think is important. And then I'm going to add a third one here that I've reflected on a lot lately is there is a reality that we're all human and sometimes things just don't work out. And I have been weirdly comforted the last few years of the story of Paul and Barnabas having that bitter split. And if you actually read this story, it multiplied the kingdom. Barnabas went to Cyprus and established the church there. It actually created space for new leaders like Silas and others to emerge. So in the long run, it didn't thwart the purposes of God, even though it was painful. And I don't know that we can see this in the biblical text, but I have a hunch that what happened years later was maybe Paul, at least, I get hints of this in his writing, and hopefully Barnabas as well, got to the end of their life and were able to recognize that God used it. And even though it was painful, maybe it wasn't the end of the world that I'm guessing that it might have felt like at that time. And this is something for me that I've seen as I work with churches and church staff. Sometimes we're human. Trust breaks down, something happens. It's so painful. And if you're in ministry long enough, there's no way you're going to avoid this scenario. It doesn't mean that the other person or church or whatever is the Antichrist, and I think that's the danger we can fall into. Sometimes it's another godly person doing their best and things don't work out. And I think in those moments, it's sad. And I think we have to fight for the relationship and how to navigate it well. But if we go into it thinking that every situation will always work out and the team will always stay intact, then, I think sometimes we're setting ourselves up for enduring pain rather than having the honesty to say, in this situation, this life group right now, we just have different visions. Let's bless each other. Let's fight for the relationship. So when I see them at church on a Sunday or I see them at the mall, that our relationship is still secure, even if we have to have that honest conversation that partnering together in this life group or in this church or on this staff isn't going to work going forward. So that is a reality. You will not escape that reality. And I think it's even right there in the very pages of scripture. If it was a reality for the early church, it's probably going to be a reality for us. And this is a good teaser for next month of let's do, though, acknowledging that it's a reality. Let's make sure that we are thoughtful in how we navigate it.
That's good. So just as a summary of what we've been talking about today, is Jesus worked with Peter, James, and John, and I understand that team to be the first fivefold ministry team. So Jesus, this was his mindset, to make godly relationships foundational and to share leadership authority and responsibility. And so, as we've been talking about today, he did that by building unity around kingdom essentials, fostering DNA through participation, catalyzing diversity of spiritual gifts with those three individuals, orienting them gradually, sustaining them through a culture of development, which is coaching and expecting ongoing challenges, which absolutely happened after the church started. So I wanted to share a quote from a book in regards to this type of team ministry approach. Neil Cole has a great book entitled Primal Fire. J.R. Woodward has a great book, Creating a Missional Culture. This particular book, Permanent Revolution by Hirsch and Ketchum, is another fantastic book, which really addresses and jumps in to the challenge of fivefold ministry. But I wanted to read this. I think it's relevant for us. As far as we can discern, every observable, highly transformative apostolic movement that achieved exponential missional impact has operated with some expression of fivefold ministry. And so what Drew and I have simply been communicating is that fivefold ministry is actually what Life Groups is all about. Just everything that we've been talking about in terms of loving people well and equipping is really just the basics of a group of people living life together in a community context. So Drew, how about wrapping this up?
Yeah, Charlie, I love how you bring it back to that in the end. And that's as we walk through Ephesians, which is consistently the text we go back to. What's happening here? We have the one body of Christ, the one spirit that has equipped people differently for the sake of equipping the saints for the work of the ministry. And it's really that simple and that hard, all
right,
wrapped up together is what we're calling us all towards. And, it is challenging. It's, I think in the context of church planting, you probably aren't going to have a mature fivefold expression on day one. And so what you have to do is you have to have a vision for it so that you work towards it. And there's going to be things you have to navigate. You may not have a prophetic voice in your church right at the beginning. So who are prophetic voices that you can lean on outside of your church? And then how are you intentionally developing? How are you bringing in prophetic fathers and mothers and getting them time with younger people in the church so that 5 and 10 years from now, you do have a prophetic voice on your fivefold team? So we're not trying to gloss over the fact that this is really hard, but what we are asking is let's have a vision for it. Let's see a vision for what this could be. And that's what's always inspired me going back to Life Group. I had a vision for what it could be. And that helped navigate the tensions in the moment of what wasn't there yet, because I had something I was looking for. I was trying to keep my eye out. Where is the evangelist? I'm not an evangelist. Where is that person? And as soon as I see somebody, how can I raise them up? How can I empower them, release them? Because I recognize they bring something I don't have. I can be very confident in my leadership, in what I bring, and secure in that. And part of that security is recognizing what I don't bring. And so how do we find those people ultimately for the sake of what God's called us to do? So we'll leave you with that today. And this is a good lesson where maybe you see how a lot of the themes we've been talking about tie in together, both on a micro scale and a macro scale. And so we'll leave you with this. And then next time, look forward to jumping back in as we talk through transitions.